Hello and welcome to my channel. Today we are going to paint this dashing Eastern Bluebird. So first I started by applying a glaze of ample amount of water with my biggest brush. Please take your time and let the paper really soak in the water. With the same brush in hand, I now took some Winsor Blue, very dilute, tea-like consistency, and applied it all over the bird's head and back as a base layer. Being very careful, not allowing any paint to enter into the eye area, this is the only area which I did not wet when I applied the glaze of water. I also applied dilute Winsor Blue on the tail feathers. When the shine on the paper was gone, I lifted some paint from this area. If you want, you can leave this area unpainted while applying the first layer. I preferred lifting here because I think it creates softer edges. So while the base layer was drying, I took my round brush number 3 and a very dilute burnt sienna to start painting the eyes. I painted the whole area inside the eye except for the white highlight, and if you don't want to use a masking fluid, use the wet on dry technique. That is to say, do not wet the paper in the eye area to paint it. So when the burnt sienna layer was dry, I took my thinner brush 000 and a thicker consistency of Payne's Grey to start marking out the iris and also shaping the eye. Please take your time to paint the eye. It is a very delicate area and it is very important not to lose the white highlight of the eye to create realism. And also use the Payne's Grey to paint the rim of the eye. Then I applied another layer of Payne's Grey to darken the eye area. Depending on the level of contrast you might get from different layers of different pigments, you have to apply as many layers as required. Then I took a thicker consistency of burnt umber to paint on the iris of the bird's eye to give it a little bit of warmth. Now that the base layer or the first layer was completely dry, so I applied some water on the forehead of the bird and then dropped in French ultramarine blue, thicker consistency, and then used my brush to spread it upwards. Then I dropped in some Payne's Grey, thicker consistency as well. My round brush 000 and a thicker consistency of Payne's Grey to create a very light feather texture here. Now I applied a glaze of water on the neck area of the bird and then took a very dilute burnt sienna, and then with my round brush 000 I created the feather texture by doing short outward flicks, and then I did the same thing here near the beak of the bird. Then I took my round brush 3 and Payne's Grey, thicker consistency to darken the area around the eyes. Here in this area, I wanted to apply the salt technique. I have broken it down in 2 steps, but those of you who are already familiar with the salt technique, you can do this in just 1 step. So first I applied a glaze of water and then dropped in French ultramarine blue and created the feather textures with my round brush 000 and then let it dry. So while it was drying, I applied a glaze of water on the chest of the bird and its belly, and then applied a very dilute burnt sienna with my round brush number 6, dropping it here and there, leaving plenty of white space in between to depict the white feathers, and then use my brush to soften the edges wherever required. And then I took a thicker consistency of burnt umber to apply on the top part of the chest, and then use my thinner brush 000 with flicking motion to create feather texture. Also dropped in a little bit of the thicker consistency of burnt umber under the wing feathers. Now when the paper was completely dry here, I applied a glaze of water, then dropped in some French ultramarine blue and used my brush to spread it around. Then I took common salt or table salt and sprinkled it over the moist area. And then removed the salt when the paper was completely dry. Then with my round brush number 3, I applied a thicker consistency of Payne's grey, creating feather textures in this area. Now coming to the beak, I applied a very dilute Payne's grey on both the lower and the upper beak, and then let it dry. Meanwhile, I first applied a glaze of water on the branch and then took desert green from Schmincke. It's a very beautiful granulating pigment, and then applied this pigment on the branch on the top area. Now here we are going to do some negative painting, that is to say, painting the branch is going to give shape and form to the feathers of the bird. I switched to my thinner brush to make the feather texture with flicking motion. And I dropped some French ultramarine on the lower part of the branch to create visual interest and to echo the color of the bird on the branch. Now I applied a thicker consistency of Payne's grey with my round brush number 3 to reinforce the color. Then I used my round brush 000 and a thicker consistency of Payne's grey to create the fine line to distinguish between the upper and the lower beak. I felt like all the feather details just below the eye area was a bit distracting, so I took a slightly damp brush and gently rubbed over the area to remove some of them. Moving on to the wing feathers now, I took my round brush number 3 and a tea-like consistency of French ultramarine blue, and first I laid down the French ultramarine blue and used my brush to spread the paint around. Then dropped in some more of the French ultramarine blue just at the base of the top feather, and then used my 000 round brush to create some feather texture there. Then I took my 000 round brush and a thicker consistency of Payne's grey to paint the tip of the feathers, which are black in color. Taking my thin brush, once again making outward flicking motion to create some feather textures. Now coming to this wing feather, which I deliberately left unpainted in order to keep a gap between the top and the lower wing feathers so that the paints would not bleed into each other. Since these individual wing feathers are quite small in area, so I did not apply any glaze of water first. I directly applied the paint, which is also quite dilute. And first I applied French ultramarine and then applied the Payne's grey on the tip and around the border of each and every wing feather. Here I dropped in a small amount of burnt sienna. Here in the lower part of the wing feathers, I applied only Payne's grey thicker consistency. In this part of the wing feather, first I applied a wash of French ultramarine in the whole area, and then with my round brush 000, I simply drew on the lines following my sketch. For this tail feather on the left, I applied both Payne's grey and French ultramarine blue. And dropped in some more thicker consistency French ultramarine blue at the point where the tail starts. On this tail feather on the right, I first applied a glaze of water and then applied a thicker consistency of French ultramarine blue and used my brush to spread the paint. Then I took my round brush 000 and a thicker consistency of Payne's grey to paint the darker parts of the feather. Then I applied a thicker consistency of French ultramarine blue on this side of the feather to enhance the color. To paint these tiny feathers, I used the negative painting technique, that is to say, applying color on the area around the subject. So first I lay a dilute consistency of French ultramarine around the feather I want to paint, and then use my damp brush to soften the edges. I used a very dilute burnt sienna and also a very dilute Payne's grey to paint the feet of the bird, and also used a thicker consistency of Payne's grey to paint the claws. When you think your painting is finished, it is a good idea to come back to the painting the next day or after a couple of days to see with fresh eyes if any adjustments are required. So here I noticed that I had to adjust a little bit more the wing feathers. Also I applied a little bit more of French ultramarine blue on the forehead of the bird to reduce the contrast between the two different shades of blue. I also applied another layer of burnt sienna on the belly area of the bird, just on the top part. Thank you very much for watching till the end. Please like, share and subscribe if you haven't already, and I will see you next week with a new tutorial. Bye for now.